Okay, and Moore's law, that is the ever-increasing evolution of digital technology and the computational capacity over time. We can discuss that. Well, for the sake of time, I will spare you this discussion now, but I'm happy to get back to this. We know that there is a debate ongoing of whether Moore's law is about to slow down or is not applicable anymore. This exponential increase in computing capacity over time. I actually disagree with this, but it very much depends also on whether we'll be able to achieve one or two important breakthroughs in digital technology over the coming years. The fact that, in particular, with the advent of the internet, we ended up having an end-to-end architecture where everybody can talk to everybody else, originally with no filtering of this communication. That is something that, if you couple it with the digital nature of the information that is exchanged on the internet, really determines the possibility of achieving what you see at the bottom, scale without mass. The fact that companies that develop a business model knowing that they can replicate and duplicate their products at zero marginal cost can actually conquer any part of the market in any part of the world if the internet and the digital technology ecosystem remains interconnected. And they can do this also by counting on the fact that the digital ecosystem is typically modular in the sense that it has been built on bases that are really based on open protocols. And it is based on the creation of system goods where different modules can have to coexist in order to really provide the maximum potential. If you put all these things together and you also analyze what happens when you combine these things together, then you find many of the reasons why the internet has developed the way it has over the first 20 years. And some of the trends that we have observed until now, but are not necessarily the ones that we will observe from now on, are in this evolution part that I've put together. The fact that computational capacity has increased over time, and the fact that network effects have been able to generate what we call the winner-take-all part of the digital ecosystem, has created and has led to the emergence of the large platforms and the superstar firms, as we call them today. We were already very impressed by the emergence of trillion-dollar companies in the beginning of this year. Today, we talk about $2 trillion companies. This has happened also thanks to COVID or due to COVID over the past months, with some of these companies that have really taken the elevator and going up into unbelievable and unprecedented values in the market capitalization. This is also, and in particular, due to the fact that, one, the internet is this machine that can achieve things at scale very, very quickly. And the fact that the digital nature of the information and the ability to achieve scale without mass has led some companies to take over the attention of the end users compared to others, creating what we call the attention economy. But it's also due to the fact that policymakers have witnessed this evolution without reacting in any swift way. Other things that we've seen, the emergence of the collaborative economy is really the product of the end-to-end architecture, the emergence of P2P business models, peer-to-peer platforms, and as similar and particular variants of them, distributed ledger technologies, and as a subvariant of them, blockchain, and also the fact that the digital ecosystem has started to generate this enormous amount of information, coupled with the emergence of the digital platforms, has created a new demand for technologies and techniques that had been discarded in the past, such as machine learning, that are extremely data hungry, that are now viable, and indeed, perhaps the most important techniques in AI that we have today, and in particular because this unprecedented amount of data has been made available. So what we've seen, if I had to summarize it in one sentence, let's say over the past 2-3 decades, is an enormous production of information, an enormous concentration of the attention of the end users in the hands of a few players. And this has created also the demands that these players are now observing and translating into massive investments in machine learning to be able to make the most out of this information and develop very tailored, very granular business models that are able to capitalize on almost every behavior that the end user put in place. Now, this has created a number of tendencies and results that I don't have the time to fully explore here, but I just list them. The digitization and the rise of information goods as a dominant means of a trade and exchange. The original end-to-end design was originally neutral, meaning no way to filter communications in between the edges, in between the end users. Today, obviously, completely transformed into a non-neutral environment. The rise of system goods and modular, granular business models. The transition from goods to access to goods. So the age of access, as Jeremy Rifkin already called it many, many years ago. The increased virtualization of functions, including, and thanks to the cloud computing and the potential access to everything as a service. So what we sometimes call servitization as well. The platformization I've already mentioned. The competition for eyeballs. So the rise of so-called attention merchants, as Tim Wu defined them in a recent book. The ever-changing architecture, the shifting of entry possibilities, a very stable today layer of platforms in this ecosystem, but a very vibrant app environment, if you wish, on top of the platforms. The rise of big data, machine learning, and data crunching algorithms, and the disappearance of prices, if you wish. The fact that everything can now be so tailored that everybody gets an individual personalized price. Now, this for government and public policy has a number of consequences. I'm not going to explore them all here. I can share the slides, obviously, but definitely the virtualization, the servitization, and the platformization of the economy. Sorry for all the Asians, but these are some of the key phenomena that we have observed until today. Now, is this the basis for our regulation of technology today? I'm not sure. Actually, when we look at this, and also going back to the starry sky, sometimes I have the impression that we are in a sort of a paradox of motion situation. It's just like what ancient philosopher Zeno postulated when defining his own paradox of motion. He would say, however fast if Achilles bases his next jump on where the tortoise is, Achilles would jump here in this image on A2, but the tortoise will have made that additional step so that Achilles will not reach it. If Achilles now jumps on A3, the tortoise will have made another jump, so Achilles will never reach it. Now, in this paradox, Achilles never reaches the tortoise. And in the situation in which we are now, if we want to be evidence-based or retrospective to some extent in defining a problem and finding a regulatory solution, we actually end up in an even worse situation where our laws, our public policies are a tortoise trying to chase Achilles. So unless we find a way to be more agile, more outcome-based, more principles-based, so that we jump, for example, in that image directly on A2 T3, in T3, then we will never be able to catch up with the existing technologies. So what does this mean for our public policies? I want to also give you a quick examples of how even people that are supposed to get it right, like me, get it wrong very often. Recently, I had tried, a couple of years ago, I tried to build a paper a little bit more discursive than the papers that I normally write on the basis of a fictitious story. It was a story of a person that I called Ben that at some point in his life discovers that he's terminally ill. And he's terminally ill, and he discovers that he has only 6 months to live, unfortunately. And there is a company that contacts him and asks him whether he would be willing to share all his thoughts and also the data that is disseminated in social networks or in other parts, including past writings, could be also analog writings that could be converted into digital. And if he would, for free, be able to participate in a program where this company would also then interview his family, some of his friends, asking for his political opinions, his musical tastes, his tastes for cinema and movies. And so that when Ben will be dead, the company will be able to create an avatar of Ben. And with the use of modern AI technologies, for example, generative adversarial networks, the avatar will very look like Ben and age like Ben could have, and also develop new opinions on things that happen, maybe scraping data from social media. Ben will be able to tell his daughter or son that he is very happy because a friend has had a baby, because you could see that on Facebook or on other social media that someone is celebrating, scrape it, transform it into an opinion and an expression and emotion of a person that is the avatar of someone who has been alive until recently. When there's new elections, Ben will be able to advise on what to vote for, or what he would vote for if he could. And the company that manages Ben gradually sees an opportunity in this, obviously, because you can provide advice, but you can also project a person in the future and maybe have that person change his mind, in the case of Ben, his mind, and maybe, implicitly give suggestions that maybe are not necessarily completely neutral. Now, I thought I was very smart that I was developing something like that. I think this is a very nice story when to turn it into a paper. When I was writing it, I discovered that Black Mirror, the TV series, was basically developing an episode titled Be Right Back that is really dealing with something very similar. I discovered that at the death of Roman Mazurenko, a famous influencer in Russia, in 2015, already his girlfriend had transformed into a grief bot, in this case, a chat bot with the personality of Roman Mazurenko. But still, what I had in mind was a little bit more advanced, more different. But then earlier this year in January, I saw the South Korean broadcaster publishing a documentary which is absolutely excruciating and not recommended for the ones that are that get emotional very easily. I had to watch it just because, for professional reasons, of a mother celebrating a daughter's 7th birthday in virtual reality, despite the fact that the daughter had passed away 3 years before. And the generative adversarial network technique that was used, it's the same that is used in deepfakes, for example, today, and that really worries many policymakers because of the fact that it's very difficult to distinguish the real from the fake in the ability of these AI systems to reproduce the tone of the voice and the resemblance, the face in particular of public and private figures. As you see on the left hand of the screen, a private figure, the daughter of the lady, and on the right hand, Vladimir Putin. And so this is something that prompts a number of new challenges that we would need to deal with, without necessarily thinking only about, for example, how modern digital platforms potentially discriminate, but also thinking about how in the future we might be nudged in our public opinions thanks to the use of digital technologies that are really embedded in what we call extended reality. So are we ready for this? And when we regulate current AI, for example, are we regulating the AI that we see in Netflix's recommendation engine, or are we thinking also about what can happen in these cases? Now, while we approach a topic like this, we also discovered that many of the things that are portrayed as automated are also a little bit of an illusion today, so that the AI is sold as something that can solve many problems. But indeed, there is something going on there that is maybe more worrying than the rise of AI itself. For example, the fact that companies like Amazon, while on the one hand promising the checkout free store, so the place where you just go in and out and you have paid without talking to anyone or stopping by a cashier, indeed is employing dozens of people in Madagascar to manually correct the machine when it gets it wrong. And you discover a parallel world in which work is even more precarious, not only, but it's even more paradoxical, meaning that these people not only work by the day, and they can have their contracts terminated very quickly. Imagine what has happened in the United States with COVID. And from 300,000 people on unemployment subsidies to 30 million in 3 weeks. And this is in the US. Think about what happens in Madagascar with the US companies. Not only they work by, on a day-by-day basis, but also they are training with their work a machine that maybe one day will become accurate enough to replace them. So they're digging their own grave, professionally speaking. We also discovered that the same techniques that we use here in order to observe everybody can be used also to profile people from a social perspective, and that this is not just a Chinese problem with the social credit scoring, but it can happen in the Netherlands as opposed to Denmark or to many other countries that are now experimenting with the use of AI in government, with a lot of potential promises and opportunities, but also a number of potential downsides. And the JRC has recently published a series of very interesting reports on the use of AI, in particular in government, that I recommend everybody to read, and certainly will be part of this training program. So we're also discovering that this unprecedented amount of data puts us in a position in which, think about, you know, the extended reality I showed you before. We will be surrounded increasingly by data, but the most important thing will not be the amount of data that is there, but which data we trust. So for me, the people that say data is a new oil, apart from the fact that oil has been a curse for many countries rather than an opportunity or a source of wealth, I think this has to be clearly replaced with a different sentence. So if we manage to build a trustworthy digital environment where the data can flow in a way that people can really trust, then we will have, if you think that oil is a good thing, then we will have the new source of wealth and growth. Otherwise, we're running an enormous risk. And we need to think about this when we regulate. So how is regulation, very quickly, going to look like in the future? Well, certainly we cannot be a retrospective, like in all the manuals on of public policy. You know, evidence-based policymaking now has to be flanked by foresight policymaking. At the EU level, a good example of this has been the publication of the data strategy, where Commissioner Breton has said, listen, I want to have a data strategy, not for today's data markets, which are largely markets in which 80% of the data end up in the cloud and 20% stay on the devices. I want to have a data strategy that accounts for what I think will be the transformation over the next 5 years. In 5 years, I expect 80% of the data to be in the devices or close to the devices in what we call the edge layer, and only 20% would be on the clouds. So we want to develop rules and even public policies for the future evolution of the market. Again, Achilles and the turtle, the starry sky, as opposed to simply trying to solve tomorrow the problems of yesterday, right? So foresight-based also means that we are waiting for this second data wave. And the EU has an opportunity to lead the world in trustworthy technologies, to work on the current explosion of data and business to consumers application, to try to rebalance competition and value creation and distribution in these value chains, to compete in AI for good. So to really develop those solutions, in particular on artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things, that can lead us towards AI closest to the things or embedded in the things in a way that helps us advance towards our sustainability and resilience of public policy objectives, and specialize in the role of government as catalyst of innovation. So these are, I think, 4 pillars of how we are prospective in our policies. We also have to be, in order to be more solid and stable in what we project into the future, principles-based. And here's the famous calls for EU values or key principles. And in my experience in the high-level expert group on AI, we have come to agree on 4 key values of future digital technologies, including AI: the respect for human autonomy, the prevention of harm as a principle, fairness as a principle, and explicability as a principle. And then we have moved on to transforming this principle into 7 requirements of future artificial intelligence that you see listed there. And then we have further transformed those requirements into an interactive platform for self-assessing the trustworthiness of one's own technologies that is called ALTAI, so Assessment List on Trustworthy AI, which we released in a software form in June this year. And that is an example of how you can be principles-based and then operational at the same time with a tool that is agile. And I'll get back to this in a second. So not only principles-based, regulation and public policy also have to become clearly outcomes-based. And in my opinion, the most complete roster of targets and indicators that one could think of in developing a public policy for the digital environment today remains the Sustainable Development Goals. You don't deploy an AI policy by thinking about becoming competitive in AI. AI is a means to an end. So you develop an AI policy, for example, by thinking about how is AI going to help you achieve goal number 8 on decent work and economic growth, which is essentially a full employment full and decent employment goal? And obviously the answers you give in public policy to the question, how can AI achieve decent work and economic growth, and the question, how we are competitive in AI, the answers might be completely different. So we have to make sure that we get there. The approach also has to be proportionate. Not all uses of digital technologies create the same risk. And the evolution of risk is also very difficult to monitor. We need to find a way to be proportionate and risk-based, not to kill innovation, but at the same time, we need to recognize that a lot of the risks are not visible in the labs with digital technologies. They materialize once these technologies hit the market, they interact with human beings, and increasingly they interact with other digital technology. Think about multi-AI context. I'm happy to elaborate further on this. Regulation public policy has to become agile. So it means we cannot write everything in the law. What I have seen in the early steps of the Commission in developing a regulation for AI does not go in this direction. If you put everything in the law in a way that is clearly dictated by, for example, machine learning, the further evolution of AI will have no contact with the words that are written in the regulation. So in principle, you will need to change the regulation every 6 months. So, and this is something that we cannot afford. We need an adaptive, agile approach to regulation. And finally, it's unlikely that the EU can, in particular Europe, but also its member states can achieve this alone. We need to make sure that we are not squeezed in between a global evolution that is really seeing the rise of a rivalry between two superpowers that seem to have little attention for the values that we try to advance at EU level. So the three scenarios that we see today are either an increasingly global partnership on AI, that is something that might happen with like-minded countries in particular. It is emerging. I'm happy to elaborate further on this, or a more restricted trust network between really what the US calls like-minded countries, so Canada, UK, Japan, and the European Union, if you wish, but not the rest of the world. Or in a scenario in which actually there is a full splinter net. There is a really two ways of approaching the internet, two sets of protocols really parting ways. So that is another external front in which then we have to work on in order to make sure that all the other principles of smart regulation of digital technologies are not frustrated by the fact that the EU is inevitably doomed to play a smaller role in the global economy in the next decades. So what does it mean very quickly in terms of the approach to digital technologies? We have been used to understanding and interpreting the internet with this initial graph. It's what is called sometimes the OSI layered representation of the internet, with the physical part at the bottom, the traffic rules, if you wish, the logical layer in between, and then applications, content, and finally the end users. The first 2.5 decades of the internet have only done this, if you wish. They have created an intermediate, very fat layer in which, together with the traditional open internet, we have had the rise of cloud-based platforms that have really, that now really control the bulk of the visible internet traffic, at least, with an enormous presence in and influence on the way the digital ecosystem evolves. What we're going to see tomorrow is different, and we need to think about this. Connectivity changes. It's not just about, I don't know, optical fiber versus 4G. We're talking about 5G, but also a number of other protocols in connectivity, in particular low power one, which are more useful for specific applications. Think about agriculture. Some of them are named there. A cloud that is not, that tries to respond to the 5 big cloud operators, not with the European Alibaba or with the European IBM or Microsoft, but with a federation of technical protocols such as Gaia X that creates space for everybody under the condition that the European principles and rules are complied with as code, not as legal code, but as software code. And I'm happy to get back there. So embedding rules into code is one of the key challenges of the EU. The blossoming Internet of Things and edge layer with an estimated 1 trillion connected devices by 2035. It's an enormous increase, and it's the beginning of what will soon become a fifth element, if you wish, the data envelope that we will have to deal with in the future. Digital verification and authentication layers to enable us to operate in the digital environment in a way that is not only reflective of our identity, but also is controlled. See also that other layer, legal and semantic interoperability, in terms of the respect of the rule of law. And on top of this, what the Commission calls the data spaces. So cross-cutting data spaces on skills, on the Green Deal, on administration, and then a much more fragmented internet space in which you have sectoral data spaces, agriculture, finance, energy, as they have been presented in the data strategy, the traditional open internet, which now incorporates also distributed ledger technologies, the digital platforms as they have already emerged and mostly cloud-based, and digital government, as a set of services that will probably be a separate data space that requires enhanced trust. In all this, the end users will probably face a much more fragmented, but perhaps more trustworthy, at least partly more trustworthy vision of the internet. And in all this, artificial intelligence is not a layer, is not a market. Artificial intelligence will be everywhere. And also personal data control and in general, user and business control over data will have to be stepped up enormously. So this is a vision for the single market, and it's a vision that is compatible with trying to exercise foresight. I'm happy to hear your visions of this. And indeed, what you need to do, and basically I can summarize it very quickly by quoting Immanuel Kant. What you need to do is basically rely on these two things that fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them. The starry heavens above us, foresight, and the moral law within us. So our rules, principles, and values that need to be embedded into the digital environment. So that we are able to do two things. One is really remain at the center of all this, able to do what really differentiates humans from machines, which is the ability to distinguish reality from its representation. This is quintessential Magritte. We are able to do that much more than the machines. And also to do something that really preserves the uniqueness of each of us as a human being. So preserving our differences of views and the different perspectives that we have vis-a-vis everything, including obviously the different perspectives that we have when we look at the starry sky. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions in the remainder of the hour we have for us.
Andrea, this has been a monumental sort of a broad view of the key challenges. And it's fascinating because just before you joined us, we spent about 15-20 minutes in a general sort of kind of discussion in the group after we had sort of kind of introduced each other. And the topics that came up were really this question about the challenges of governance, reinventing what governance mean in this technologically and constant digital transformation, but now compounded by the pandemic, which in itself is an accelerator and an incubator of both opportunities and challenges. And what you put in front of us, it's a great way of looking at this and identify also a way forward, which I think it's exactly what we need. I'll open the floor. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have an opportunity to quiz Andrea, and please move forward. I would like to hear in particular from the young PhD students first, okay? Because they need they have an opportunity here to ask the question. So I'd like to ask them first. So who is stepping up and would like to put a question? Don't be shy. Natalia.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to thank Andrea because it has been a really interesting presentation. And I would like to ask you, because by reading the white paper on AI, I concluded that there was like a three bias proposal in order how to deal with artificial intelligence, whether to reach a new regulation, to use the current regulation to adapt it to the new challenges, or not to regulate at all. And you've mentioned in your presentation an adaptative approach to regulate AI. So I would like to ask you to develop on this a little bit more. What do you think would be the best solution?
Okay, maybe let's see if there are maybe another 1 or 2 questions, and then to get Andrea then to address them, all of them. So thank you, Natalia, for that. Anybody else?
I can.
Christina, yeah, here you go. Yes.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I was interested in when you mentioned the risk base and that some of the risks are not identifiable in the labs. I'm interested in this because my PhD project is about identifying vulnerabilities in households with IoT devices by looking at their practices and how they use these devices in their everyday life. So I was wondering if you could say something more about this and about your perspective on this.
Although you certainly know more. You certainly know more because you're already in the starry sky. I can see.
Okay, a third question.
I am agreeing with Elena's interest here because, as Helena said in her presentation, we are working on the same project. Both our PhDs are inside the same bigger project. And especially I am interested in how humans weight in this risk discourse, and how the different aspects of human interactions and characteristics can actually influence the risk they are vulnerable to when approaching devices, IoT devices especially.
Okay, well, thank you all. So, Andrea.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question by Marina was, I think, by Natalia. By Natalia on the white paper and the adaptive approach. Yes, the Commission in the white paper outlines a number of potential policy scenarios, right? But this is standard practice. Allow me to say this in between us. It's standard practice that it's the practice of what we call impact assessment of legislation. You always have to outline a sort of a baseline scenario in which the Commission doesn't do much, but maybe limits itself to fine-tuning what is there. I don't think this has ever been on the table, clearly, meaning that the Commission has always had in mind since the early communications on AI that there is something unique about AI that deserves the introduction of specific new rules. And there is something very cross-cutting about AI that makes it very difficult to rely exclusively on sector-specific legislation, which is present sometimes, but not everywhere. And interestingly, one of those potential angles that one could adopt in looking at existing legislation is product safety, if you wish, right? So you could say, well, there's a product safety legislation, which, there's a new approach at the EU level. It's called new, but it's from the 90s. That really leads to setting in the same way performance specifications for all products or almost all products, and then you approach this through what we call conformity assessment, right? So I want to know whether a refrigerator is safe enough. Then before placing it into the market, I bring it to a notified body. I go through the testing, and if it's the conformity assessment is positive, then I can get the CE marking, and then I'm safe. I can circulate in the internal market. But obviously, and this is still in what the European Commission wants to do, but it is also clear that many products, in particular the software ones, where AI will be embedded, are not subject to this product safety legislation. And that is the first problem. So you need to be more horizontal and create rules for, I don't know, extended reality is not necessarily in a fridge or in a bicycle or in anything that is tangible that is already subject to product safety legislation. There is a second order of problems, and it is, are we really talking only about safety? No, the risks of AI are also chiefly about fundamental rights. So safety and fundamental rights, can we solve them with the same set of rules? Certainly not with product safety legislation. Can we have, you know, a patchwork of product safety legislation and maybe GDPR plus or something like this? Or do we need something else? So that is the second order of problems. We cannot have a sort of a one-size-fits-all solution because the risks are fundamentally different. If you look inside AI, this difference becomes even more complicated because while most of the safety problems might originally emerge already when you're designing the product and developing the product, most of the fundamental rights problems emerge when you decide to what specific use you want to put the AI. So for example, you want to use a specific, I don't know, natural language or computer vision application or a natural language processing application in support of, I don't know, a search for legal text, or you want to use it as a chatbot that answers citizens' questions or decides on the spot who should be admitted to a specific care in healthcare. I mean, all these are largely similar AI techniques that maybe are used in the specific context in a way that creates completely different types of risks. So you cannot use conformity assessment, which is typically in the manufacturer's hands. You will need to have the deployers of AI be subject to some form of responsibility. And again, you're outside of the traditional legal framework, so you need to do something. What is the Commission doing to face all these problems? Well, currently the issue is the Commission wants to have a conformity assessment procedure for both safety and fundamental rights, and this simply doesn't work. And it wants to have it on the basis of 5 regulatory requirements, which are in the white paper, most of which are defined on the basis of a vision of machine learning. But in most cases, you know, I can only mention for the ones that follow AI developments, most AI experts today think that deep learning will hit a wall very soon, and it will need to be flanked by things like probabilistic programming in order to develop the next breakthrough. So the next products in AI, and also with the Internet of Things, sort of localized small data processing, most of the rules built for cloud-based, big data-based machine learning systems might be completely unfit for purpose already by the time the Parliament is discussing the Commission's proposal. So this is what I mean by the adaptive approach. Now, how does this, and I try to be quick on this, what is an agile structure for this? First of all, what is a high risk or low risk AI is something that might need to be delegated to a more agile, maybe board or expert group or agency rather than be put in the primary legislation. The Commission is trying to now build something like a principles-based framework, which is very prescriptive though, and annexes that can be more easily changed over time that incorporate the designation of which AI systems are high risk. But even in that case, the annexes are very prescriptive and there's no clear governance mechanism, agile governance mechanism around them to keep changing them over time and give at once the flexibility that is needed and the regulatory certainty that is needed for the market. So is this additional a step? Coupled with another thing that the Commission is thinking about, which is so-called regulatory sandboxes, the possibility of having experimental phases for AI systems that will give us maybe a kick towards more flexible regulation. But I think we are very far. And in the developments I see in the European Parliament, I don't see, you know, a tendency towards trying to increase the adaptive, risk-based, flexible, agile approaches to regulation. If anything, I see a more loaded set of very prescriptive regulatory requirements, including requiring that every AI developer or deployer assesses the impacts on society and the environment of their products, which is absolutely highly deserving. But I wouldn't, I mean, if I'm using AI because it's, I don't know, filtering my spam folder in my email, and I have a nice young startup that has developed that product, I might not burden them with, you know, proving that what they're doing is ecumenical. Although I understand the need for this, but you know, it's a matter of what we would call the treaty-based principle of proportionality between the means and the ends. Okay, so this brings me into the other two questions that are very interrelated. Most risks, I mean, just as an example, it's a very famous example, so sorry for bringing in something that you probably have seen before. But I think that the quintessential demonstration of the differences between the lab and reality is when Microsoft in 2016 decided to put out this chatbot called Tai and put it on Twitter to interact with the other chatbots and the other humans, to then discover that Tai had become racist and fascist in just a few minutes, and having to withdraw Tai because it has started to come out with all sort of outrageous statements. And the same could be applied to how self-driving cars might behave in a lab, in a simulation, as opposed to a situation in which you have a dedicated road or a non-dedicated road with human drivers, self-driving cars, and maybe self-driving cars with different systems optimized with different functions. So a case of multi-algorithm sector coupled with end users, where whatever can happen is way more unpredictable and creates a lot more problems. So not only it's the specific use that determines the risk that will emerge, but it's also the complex of the interactions that in most cases in the lab is much lower than what happens in reality. And one could say, fortunately, reality is a little bit unpredictable, and we are, because otherwise, I mean, there probably wouldn't even be a need for us or a good scope for us to live in the world we live in. But at the same time, we need to recognize that it's not always possible for many designers, developers of AI systems to anticipate all the risks that will emerge in the deployment phase. And even if you imagine the 1 trillion connected devices world in 2035, the need to optimize the interactions between, in particular, between machines, and then also with humans, will become a sort of a quantum problem, meaning it's something that is a very high level of complexity and will need to be orchestrated with a form of governance where we might only be marginally involved. And that is the future of technology governance that that you will need to discuss. You need to solve all these problems this week, obviously. I can only ask the questions. Now, so in IoT devices, there's something interesting. I'll get in touch with both Hélène and Christina, because I'm involved also in a parallel project for the European Commission, because you probably know that not only the Commission is working on regulatory requirements for AI, but they're also working on a new civil liability framework for AI. So what the Commission has asked me, but I'm not central in that project, I'm more the academic advisor, is to run behavioral experiments to ensure that one has a sense of, first of all, what is the relationship between the liability regime and consumer uptake of a specific technology. So I would say very little relationship, unfortunately, even if lawyers, I'm not a lawyer originally, but I mean, I'm trained in law quite extensively. The lawyers I know, they typically overestimate how much law influences consumer behavior, in particular in the digital environment, but also understanding what kind of combinations of liability would trigger which reactions in between the different phases of the value chain of AI. So should developers be held strictly liable for the damages caused to third parties or to consumers themselves by the use of a specific IoT, AI-enabled IoT device? Would this be fair? Would this kill innovation? Would they need to apportion their liability with the deployers? And who's in more law and economics terms, the cheapest cost avoider or the superior insurer in all this? It's a fascinating environment in which I think it's more useful to have to go back to the writings of Guido Calabresi, for example, on torts and accidents, than to look at the more recent papers written by many academics, because here we go back to the real foundations of how do you apportion and attribute liability, and how do you treat AI? Certainly not as a separate entity, but in the legal systems that we have, AI is actually much more similar to the rules that we have in the Code Napoleon and since ancient Roman law on the responsibility for the damage caused by a dog or an animal or a minor under custody, where you actually, it's your responsibility to sort of frame the risk that you are generating by giving a degree of freedom to specific entities. And in this case, the entity would be maybe an unsupervised learning AI system. Finally, a footnote to wrap up is the issue of human interaction that Christina was talking about. I mean, I had a long reflection on this because the European Commission is putting human oversight as one of the regulatory requirements that would need to be imposed in case an AI system is high risk, okay? So which means you deploy the system, it's high risk, and then, but if you fall under the high risk classification, then you might say, okay, I need to put a human in the loop, or a human on the loop, or at least a human in control, depending on the situation. Now, I have a different take on this. In my opinion, human oversight should be part of the design whenever possible. Well, there should be, you know, whichever type of human oversight and control you want to embed. And the meaningfulness of the human oversight should be part of the assessment of whether the AI system is high risk or not. Because obviously I can deploy an AI system that decides who's gonna get the next kidney. And the fact that there's a lot of research on kidney exchanges, so there have been very interesting papers there. And one thing is the AI system tells someone with domain expertise and responsibility, gives some hints and some assistance to the human decision making, which obviously reduces the risk, especially if there's no way to shift liability on the AI just because the AI said so, right? If there is still chiefly the responsibility of someone with domain expertise, and that person decides to use AI, this is within the overall responsibility that the human takes. And it's not necessarily, unless we show that there is some form of nudging from the AI into the human being, normally this system shouldn't be qualified as high risk, as in the case in which there is an automated system that says, Mr. X gets the kidney, because that is a much higher risk of discrimination, bias, violation of fundamental rights, and so on and so forth. So there's another difficulty there. You know, is this something that comes before the risk classification or after? In my opinion, it comes before. In the current text, it comes afterwards. And just as an example of how difficult it is. But obviously, I stop there. But there's a lot more to say about those aspects because they are fundamentally, you know, difficult, almost intractable for policymakers.
Andrea, we could do with you all week. Okay. Anybody else has a question?
I have just one question. I wanted to change a little bit maybe the direction of the conversation, and I need to take advantage of this insightful presentation. Maybe this question has been in my mind in the last 3 months, so I'm going to take advantage of you being here. So as far as I understood, I have put in chat 80-20 law, user cloud. This resonates with the technological sovereignty concept that has been very much discussed. But to be honest, I have many concerns, or for me, it's not clear so far. What do we mean with technological sovereignty? So my question is, I have the assumption that local data matters. So that means that the data ecosystem should be organized at the local, regional, subnational level at least. So 2 questions. First of all, what are the territorial implications of regions, cities dealing with data? How can you see that? What's your take on? And the second one is much more specific. I discussed with Max already about Gaia X. And so what's your opinion on that? That's the 2 questions on territorial matters. That is my domain. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Should I take it, Max, or you want to collect more?
Let's see if there's one more. If there isn't, then I'll take the opportunity as the privilege of the chair to ask you 2 brief comments as well.
Alexander had a question. I saw Alexander trying to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about this idea of sandboxes, because that kind of resonated with my question. Because usually when you see how GRC and Commission operates, we always passively observe, while sometimes it's good maybe to do interventions. Yeah, and even, you know, from Estonian perspective, I know that for many years, big telecom companies have been using Estonia as a test country to run new services. And if everything goes wrong, it's still kind of okay because it's Estonia. Can you comment about sandboxes a little bit more? Is it really near future that we can have some AI experimented on some sort of closed population?
Okay. And Max, you wanted to add one?
There's just maybe just a brief one, but I think that we always try to traditionally we have tried to regulate the behavior of society, of human to human. Now increasingly we are trying to regulate the interaction between humans and machines. But you realize very often that what we are now increasingly talking is the machine to machine interactions, and how do we address those? Because in a way, even the legal framework would have to be framed taking that dimension into account, and not just assume that everything is humanly understandable or humanly enactable. So if you could comment on that as well, that'd be great. Okay.
Good. Okay, let me start with technological sovereignty, Igor. Obviously, this is in the mind of Thierry Breton. I mean, when he says, I want to create an industrial policy and a data strategy for the 2080 era, where we are currently in the 80-20, so where knowing that most of the data might be or will be stored locally in the future, so enabling more decentralized architectures, if you wish. This is what he means, and there is an opportunity for Europe to not only create a federated cloud that somehow reduces our dependence on the big cloud operators, and if anything, forces them to come under the umbrella of specific technical protocols that embed compliance with EU rules, and that's the scale up of Gaia X. But I want to also stimulate through things like IPCEIs, for example, the projects of common European, the important projects of common European interests, or the flagship initiatives, or the public-private partnership on AI in the future. I want to stimulate investment in a dense edge layer dominated by the companies that have already their footprint in that specific sector. The BMWs, the Daimlers, the Orange, the Solvay. I mean, depending on or where you look at the industrial context and sector in Europe. So there are two things to be said there. This comes from the recognition of the fact that the early evolution of the internet has transformed what we were calling global value chains in what we call now global value capture, meaning that a lot of the knowledge generated not only by the end users, but also by real economy companies, real economy businesses, has been gradually captured by the ones that were managing to transform this into exploit those centripetal forces to then capitalize on users' attention and those data, for example, by selling advertising spaces or by developing multifaceted business models. This is a trend that needs to stop, and the value has to now percolate back into the economy. Now, do we need technological sovereignty for this, or simply meaningful reforms? I think we need simply meaningful reforms. We don't need to have made in Europe software or things like this, but we need to set rules that are about allocating the value from production, and then let's have the Chinese and the Americans come in and try to compete on those rules. Similar to this is the developments in competition law that are much more, let's say, expansive today compared to the past. The Commission is working on the so-called new competition tool that will add the possibility to act by imposing, for example, data interoperability, even if a company is not abused of a dominant position. Or in the Digital Services Act, there is also a new ex-ante sets of remedies that are being worked on. This is all aimed at what I very briefly defined before as rebalancing competition in B2C and trying to conquer and be present at least in B2B. Simply saying it has to be made in Europe, I think is problematic. And if you want me, with a little bit of a joke, when I heard Thierry Breton saying, You know, Europe's share of the data economy is much smaller than the Europe's share of the global economy in terms of GDP. So we need to align the two. It meant that we should bring the share of the data economy closer to the share of the GDP, but we can actually do also the other way around. If you are too protectionistic, you will reach the goal by simply squeezing and shrinking the EU's share of the global economy so that we also have a similar share in the data economy and in GDP, but just because the one on GDP has gone down. And so that is, I think, the risk. And during my work in the high-level expert group, 5-6 times I had to manually take out of the text of the things that we were writing the words made in Europe and replace them with made according to European values, because this idea that we have to do everything in-house, I think is anti-historical and might lead us in a position to really play a strong role in the world, maybe in 20 years, if we really do everything well. So I see that rather the idea of sovereignty is rather more connected to the extraterritorial nature of rules that was already in GDPR. So whoever wants to come to the single market has to comply with specific rules. But the thing is, both in GDPR 2.0 and in the future rules, we will have to become increasingly good, as I was saying before, at embedding the rules, not in legal codes, but in software codes. Think about smart contracts, you know, largely are without jurisdiction today. They have to be, if they need to be used in Europe, they need to embed those lines of code that guarantees, to the extent possible, their alignment with EU values, principles, and rules. And that is a story to be written from now on, but no one's written it in not the US, neither the US nor China, nor the EU. So in doing this, I think we will have to experiment. So I turn to sandboxes. I have become over time a little bit, I use the term, but as you saw, I've become a little bit allergic to the term sandboxes, just because experimental policymaking is made of many, many different things, including, for example, randomized controlled trials in healthcare, including what in DG Connect sometimes is called rapid prototyping or ideation sprints. But most of the world calls them simply sandboxes. Now, the German government, for example, has had a long, commissioned a long study on sandboxes. The Austrian government has done the same. Obviously, this comes from the early experience of the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK for fintech. But as of today, we still don't know what a sandbox is. And in most cases, you call it a sandbox. And in most of these cases of what I've seen, the inner structure and the design of the sandbox in terms of what data are you going to produce? How am I going to monitor that this is really something that can be scaled up to the full market? How am I going to verify that you are not manipulating this data or that the design of the experiments is sufficiently sound? There's nothing like this in the evolution of our knowledge on sandboxes. So even if I've seen in the current draft of the AI regulation an entire section dedicated to sandboxes, I think this is still largely a buzzword. So this, I mean, you've seen, Alexander, that when I was talking about, how I see the future of the single market, if you look at the layered structure of X-Road, it's very similar, right? It's the open API structure, the possibility of experimenting with data, and so on. I think where we're going is in a situation in which we will need enhanced guidance by someone. JRC, obviously, Policy Hub as Policy Center is probably the best place on experimental policymaking and how do we really make it meaningful? How do you choose a sector? And then I think my impression is also the more I hear the European Commission trying to inspire itself in the future AI regulation from the framework on medical devices, the more I see that the sandboxes will probably look very much, at least in the beginning, like the randomized controlled trials and the clinical trials that we use in healthcare, in order to understand whether something is viable enough with volunteers and to have a very structured and quite long process of understanding and assessing whether this is something that could safely be scaled up to the full market. So that is, creating experimental and pilot programs, I think will be one of the most important things to be done. Sorry, there's some background noise. People are redoing the front of my building and they obviously have arrived in my balcony right now. So finally, machine-to-machine communication. When I was talking about governance and the governance of smart contracts, for example, this is something that We haven't fully, dug into, also in social sciences and in the study of policymaking. What we know is that the internet in its first generation has been already the realm of private governance, right? Largely, also because we decided as policymakers not to enter too much into that sphere. Today, we know that half of the internet traffic is non-human. And we know that if you deploy a bot on Twitter, the bot will probably meet many more non-human bots than human bots. And already, so this interaction and the potential deviations that it generates because of the aberrations that it might create by amplifying specific biases or specific behaviors, this is something that we are only starting to get to grips with today. I can only imagine, Max, when you are into the 1 trillion connected devices world, we will probably have a very dense layer of information exchanges that have nothing to do with us. And it has to be a little bit like us relying on the laws of physics to just happen and occur naturally without our intervention when we interact with the physical environment. But we need to build those laws of digital physics, if you wish, if we want to be able to live on top of a constant interaction between machines that requires very complicated optimization processes, a lot of standardization, and a lot of rules that are created for digital governance in between machines, so that look at the overall complexity of this, rather than simply at our one-to-one interaction with one Fitbit or one piece of technology in and of itself. I don't have an answer to this. I think we're going to have to work with all of you, and with the JRC, I think it's the perfect place to start thinking about, also because of the enhanced involvement with foresight the JRC has. We're going to have to really start laying down the basic principles and rules and approaches that we will need in 5-6 years from now, when this will start to materialize in a very self-evident way. What we see, that's why I brought in the example of extended reality, because this is something that I would expect, and also the market for grief bots to become something real, palpable, tangible in our lives in the coming decade. So trust is becoming a very important word, and we actually have to fill it with meaning much more than we are doing today. And but I am, I myself will certainly not be able to cover this topic of the years to come. This becomes a multi-year, multi-disciplinary, multi-people and machines endeavor as well.
I said, thank you very much, Andrea. This has been great, and you've provided us a lot of food for thought for the whole week. I'm sure we will debate it extensively. So what I will ask is if everybody could unmute themselves so that we could give you a nice round of applause.
Before doing that, Max,
yes?
I was wondering if Andrea is able to share a more personal perspective of his work, because Andrea, you're trying to bring together so many different topics under the name of AI or whatsoever, policy, European policy. What's the secret of staying alive? I mean, it's so much what you want to cover. How do you do that? Do you have many slaves running around? So what's the personal aspect of your work?
It's actually the other way around. And thanks for the question. I will answer shortly. It's perhaps also appropriate that I answer shortly, because we are talking about someone who is a drop in an ocean of AI.
Absolutely.
I'm nobody to stand out in this respect. And actually think my impression is that it is the opposite of having had slaves. Actually, I continue after 25 years of career to do the photocopies myself, to do the research, to write every single word that I write, and so not to delegate the thinking and the writing, and that is, I think, very, very costly in terms of time and energy, but it's also perhaps the only way in which you can stay ahead of the, or at least try to see what the horizon is bringing. Now, that said, I now lead a research group of 18 people So they're not slaves, obviously, but now this group has expanded a lot more in SEPs lately. So I'm now actively in the mode of passing on this approach to each of them and see, and some of these people have a combination of knowledge that make them much better prepared than I am to really, hold the baton once the machine to machine era will finally have come. So that is, I don't know, that's the only thing that I can see as perhaps distinguishing what I've done from what I've seen in peers and colleagues that maybe have a much more attitude towards teamwork and structured teamwork.
Well, thank you, Andrea, again. And I think that if we can just give a round of applause to you for your excellent insights. And thank you for being with us. If you have the opportunity to pop in during the week, please do. I know you're super busy, but we always be welcoming your inputs and your ideas. So thank you again very much, Andrea.
Have a great week yourselves. Bye-bye. Bye.
Right.
Thank you.